Have you ever had this conversation with a friend? The classic, dude, we should quit our jobs and make a video game. I think most people probably have, but how many of you actually followed through? Well, these guys did. And it propelled them to the top of the indie game ladder. Two friends who met in college, reconnecting later in life, and catching lightning in a bottle. This is Anthony Giovanetti and Casey Yano, the creators of Slay the Spire, a game like no other. Slay the Spire is a deck-building roguelike. You pick your character, pocket some starter cards, and fight through floors of monsters, picking up more cards and relics as you go. Sound fun? Deck builders had been around for a while. The 2008 card game Dominion popularized it at game shops and served as the primary inspiration for Slay the Spire. In Dominion, 2 to 4 players draw cards and build decks, trying to beat other players sitting at the table. Dominion had tons of different card types and viable strategies. You could pursue victory cards to gain more points, use attack cards to force opponents to discard, play curse cards, which would subtract total points from a player, and use treasure cards to generate coins to buy other cards. In short, it's all about the cards. Dominion was complex enough to have endless replayability, but simple enough to pick up and start playing right away. This balance, a word which we'll come back to time and time again, was integral to the game's success. Anthony Giovanetti looked at Dominion and wanted to emulate it in a single-player experience. So he approached his friend Casey Yano, who he met back in college. He said, dude, we should quit our jobs and make a video game. And instead of being told, yeah, right, okay, Yano instead said, yeah, let's do it. Basically, on the spot, Casey quit his job at Amazon and the two got to work. They titled the project Card Crawl. Much like Dominion, they wanted the core gameplay to center around drawing cards and building a deck, but turning it into a single-player video game proved to be more challenging than anticipated. At the time, there were almost no other card games like this. One game called Hand of Fate released in 2014 and had some similar elements, but it was never really popular, and Card Crawl was going in a totally different direction. So the two had to get creative with where they drew inspiration. Hearthstone taught them to create cards that clearly communicate information to the player, cutting out as much fluff as possible. FTL served as the inspiration for the game's map system, where you choose which path to take based on risk and reward. The result is that Card Crawl's UI was very clear right from the beginning. Cards aren't crowded with numbers and walls of text, and their functions are easy to understand. Deal 6 damage, gain 5 block, draw 1 card, and discard 1 card. Of course, the cards do get more complex, especially with how they interact and synergize, but the fundamentals of the game are kept simple so as not to overwhelm new players. To that end, they settled on 3 main card types: attacks, skills, and powers. Attacks are as they sound. They directly damage enemies and often have a secondary skill like applying vulnerable or weak. Skills are utility cards, which can be used to give yourself buffs or apply debuffs on a given turn. And powers are buffs that remain active for the duration of the combat. As they continued to iterate, the ideas continued naturally. They introduced relics, which are permanent buffs that last the entire run. They created special events that mix up the gameplay loop. And they kept adding cards. Coming up with new ideas was not a problem. What was keeping everything balanced. The first thing they wanted to avoid was deck bloat. Many card games, in an effort to continue expanding, simply add more cards to the pool. For the first few expansions, this is awesome, but pretty quickly it reaches a point of diminishing returns. There's suddenly so many cards to choose from that 1, the game becomes increasingly inaccessible to new players, and 2, runs begin to rely more and more on luck. After all, it doesn't matter how good your strategy is if the cards you need never come up. Their solution was to have different characters, each with unique mechanics and a limited deck of cards. The game's first character, Ironclad, had a 75 card deck. 75 cards was the magic number for being relatively focused without feeling overly random. Sure, you're given these 75 cards, which you can build around, but there's also tons of variability. You could build around colorless cards, which are deck agnostic, spam relics for permanent buffs, or even go all out with potions and try to win that way. The flexibility from run to run, and even within a single run, meant that no 2 playthroughs felt the same. However, making sure that all of these different systems were balanced and also fun would require thousands of hours of playtesting. Right from the get-go, it was abundantly clear that Giovanetti and Yano would not be able to do all the playtesting by themselves. Thankfully, they had some help. Giovanetti was a big fan of the card game Netrunner, and by fan, I mean he maintained a fan site for the game and competed at the top level. He was able to reach out to the game's community and ask them, hey, is anyone interested in playtesting this video game we've been working on? The response was an emphatic,
woo! Yeah, baby! That's what I've been waiting for. That's what it's all about. Woo!
Pretty quickly, Card Crawl was being playtested by some of the top Netrunner pros. Players that knew card games like the back of their hands, and were more than willing to offer reliable, actionable feedback to help balance the game. The only issue is it was slow going. Believe it or not, there's not actually that many Netrunner pros out there. And while expert opinion is valuable, a card game veteran trying out card crawl is going to have a very different experience from a complete noob who's never played a card game in their life. So Yano and Giovanetti decided to outsource the process even further. They extended the invitation to friends, family, random people they met at the card shop. They created a Slack channel where anyone could leave feedback whenever they felt like it, and even created an in-house metric server that would send them data from every run that was played. Now, they were really able to sink their teeth into the numbers. Cards that were found more often in winning decks could be adjusted. Cards that were rarely being picked could be buffed or replaced. They could also see what game-breaking combos players were figuring out and decide whether they needed to be addressed.
Drop kick loop.
It was an excellent system, but one that Yano and Giovanetti approached very carefully. It would be easy to take all this shiny new data, look at the good cards versus the bad cards, and simply flatten the average so everything feels equal. But that approach would almost certainly result in runs feeling more or less the same.
As a note of caution, it's important to remember that metrics are just one tool in your designer's toolbox, and they should be used in tandem with other things.
Instead, they looked for how these cards were being used. They looked for patterns. They looked for build orders. They looked at specific card and relic combos. Then, they figured out what changes needed to be made that would balance the game, and if so, like if a certain combo or infinite was too easy to achieve, for example, how could they alter it while still keeping the cards fun? For example, they could have gotten rid of the corruption dead branch combo altogether because, oh no, it's a game-breaking infinite, but they chose to leave it in because 1, it was rare and risky to go for, and 2, it was incredibly fun. If you risked it all to get this combo online, you should be rewarded for that. Who cares if it's totally busted? Reading about their holistic approach to game balance is incredibly refreshing because they weren't afraid to put player experience above everything else. What's more impressive was that this was their first real game. Giovanetti was very clear that they wanted to be, quote, more aggressive on making changes during testing, willing to iterate and reiterate individual cards until they were as good as could be. Take Ironclad's Dual Wield, for example. When it was first released, this skill would make a copy of whatever was on the top of your deck. This wasn't very strong, as it would more often than not duplicate something not so good. Thus, it had an extremely low pick rate. Seeing this, they changed it to make it duplicate any card in your hand, which ended up being way too powerful, as duplicating certain skills led to easy infinites. So they changed it again to only work on attacks and powers, upgraded it to an uncommon rarity, and applied some minor tweaks in the ensuing weeks. In total, the card went through 6 rounds of iteration over 40 weeks before reaching its final state. This is how much time and effort went into every single card, every relic, every design choice. They were in a constant cycle of listening to feedback, applying feedback, and then asking for more feedback. At GDC 2017, Giovanetti said that in his opinion, many games enter early access too early. They have way too many bugs, they're way too unbalanced, and people don't have fun because the game isn't a game yet.
If it's not fun, why bother?
Card Crawl, which by this point had changed its name to Slay the Spire, had 2.5 years of refinement behind it. Netrunner pros, crowdsourced playtesting, Yano and Giovanetti's gentle touch. And when it entered early access on November 15th, 2017, it had everything going for it and was poised to be the next big thing. At first, however, the game didn't garner that much attention. After the first few weeks, they only had 2,000 purchases. They tried reaching out to game websites to see if they'd put out an article about the game, but to no avail. But then, they had a great idea. They started reaching out to Twitch streamers to see if they'd like to try the game for free. This approach resulted in the game spreading like wildfire. Streamers would try the game. They would praise it for how polished it felt despite being in early access. Their viewers would download the game and ask other streamers to play the game as well. Within 3 months, Slay the Spire Early Access had more than 500,000 players. They were getting as much data in a single day as they'd recorded in the past 2.5 years. But despite the success, they weren't ready to stop listening to player feedback. They upgraded the Slack channel to a Discord server. The small playtesting tool ballooned to a significantly more diverse player base, with a broader range of skills for them to analyze. They also watched streamers play the game and listened to their unfiltered feedback.
A fair price for Slay the Spire is probably like, I'm gonna say $2,400. If we're indexing it to like what the average game costs versus what I would describe as the value of the average game, Slay the Spire should probably cost as much as like a Toyota Camry or something.
After all, streamers are a lot more honest about what works and what doesn't when they're talking to their chat. And using this candid approach turned out to be a great source of information. Over the next year, Yano and Giovanetti finalized the game, making the last couple tweaks to the cards and relics, and then finally released Slay the Spire on January 23rd, 2019. Overnight, Slay the Spire became an indie game phenomenon, not just as a fun game, but as a pioneer for an entire genre. It paved the way for other deck-building roguelikes like Inscription, Cobalt Core, and Balatro. But following the game's success, Megacrit went dark for almost 7 years. People wondered if a sequel would ever come out, and if it did, could it possibly live up to the reputation of the original? Yano and Giovanetti knew that there was more they wanted to do with the game. The question was, what? The decision came down to a coin toss. Heads, they would pursue some experimental new game that Yano had been working on. Tails, they would make Slay the Spire 2. Wouldn't you know it, the coin landed on Tails. Now, creating a sequel, especially to a game that was as big as Slay the Spire, is no small feat. Yano and Giovanetti weren't going to be happy just creating an expansion pack. They needed to create a game that completely leveled up the experience across the board. However, they ran into a serious problem early on, which was the game's engine. Slay the Spire 1 was developed using libGDX, which was okay for a game made in 2017, but it was frequently broken by OS updates and didn't even have console support. So, the team switched to Unity around 2021 and got pretty deep into development until something happened in September 2023. Unity changed their runtime fee policy, which basically said they were going to start charging developers a small fee every time someone downloaded a game built on Unity's engine. This was a gut punch for indie developers. One of the most vocal groups demanding the change be reversed came from Yano and Giovanetti. Taking to Twitter, Megacrit's official page put out a post saying, quote, "Despite the immense amount of time and effort our team has already poured into the development on our new title, we will be migrating to a new engine unless the changes are completely reverted and terms of service protections are put in place." They closed out the tweet by saying, "We have never made a public statement before. That is how badly you fucked up." In the wake of the public backlash, Unity's CEO, one John Ricciatello, who you might recognize as being the former CEO of EA and the guy that basically invented lootbox microtransactions, resigned from his position, and Unity quickly adjusted their terms of service. But for the team at Megacrit, the damage had already been done. They decided to leave Unity anyway and port the entire game, 2 full years of work, over to a new engine called Godot, which is free to use and entirely funded by donations. The pivot took quite a bit of time and resources, but the results spoke for themselves. The new engine is powerful enough to run the game and provides a sense of security that the TOS isn't just going to get changed out of the blue. With everything in place, it was time to show the world what Slay the Spire 2 was going to look like. As you may know, card games are traditionally social games. Think about Go Fish, Euchre, Magic the Gathering, Dominion. You're sitting around a table, laughing and playing with your friends. Yano and Giovanetti felt like this social element was missing from the first game and wanted to emulate it somehow. But rather than pitting players against each other, why not make Slay the Spire cooperative? Have 4 characters with 4 separate decks working together to ascend to the top of the spire. It was an ambitious proposal. Balancing one deck for one player had already proven incredibly difficult, but balancing 4 decks, synergizing between 4 different people, sounded almost impossible. But if the pair had learned anything from Slay the Spire 1, it was how to do just that. They'd learned how to gather feedback. They'd learned how to leverage the community to help with the development. They'd learned how to do the impossible.
I like to think we have a pretty good conversation with our players. I think we pay very close attention to what people find interesting or delightful, or even if they don't like something, right? We try to figure out how we can flip that around and make them happy. And I think continuing to do that, this kind of back and forth conversation of just like working on the game and then getting feedback is very compelling for us.
During the development of Slay the Spire 2, Yano and Giovanetti expanded their team by a whopping 5 times. They now had an enormous team working for them, comprising 10 whole employees, and they all worked together to add more cards and characters, introduce new systems like card enchantments and in-run quests, introduce significantly more unlockables with the Epoch system, and make sure all of the cards have nice artwork. Seriously, the artwork in this game, mwah. Along with the new multiplayer mode, they also introduced multiplayer cards that can be used for some pretty disgusting combos. With the framework of Slay the Spire 1 holding it up, Slay the Spire 2 quickly grew around it and flourished around the original. Megacrit realized they had something special on their hands. Not only did the game have the same addictive gameplay loop as Slay the Spire 1, it was actually even better than the original.
We are working on a sequel to a game that kind of has an established visual style that people, I think, really attach to. I think players attach to it because this is a game that some people, play for hundreds of hours and they remember it so fondly, and we want to be able to provide them like a recognizable space, but also upgrade it in a way that it does look new, it does look fresh, it does look like a sequel.
When they announced that Slay the Spire 2 would be entering access on March 5th, 2026, it sent a ripple effect through the gaming community. Other indie games that were set to release around the same time delayed their projects, not wanting to compete with what many were expecting to be one of the biggest indie launches of the entire year. As one Polygon reporter put it, Slay the Spire 2 mogged the gaming industry in less than 24 hours. Yes, they did, Polygon. They certainly did. Within 1 week of early access going live, Slay the Spire 2 had more than 3 million players. They've already started pushing out updates on the beta server and are being very communicative with the community. If Slay the Spire 1's release is any indicator, I think we can expect a long road of playtesting before the game officially comes out in 1.0. But already, Slay the Spire 2 feels like a complete game. The 4-player co-op is refined and insanely fun. Single player feels good. 4-player co-op feels good. The new cards and systems all feel really good. And as more and more players reach the Architect, I think I speak for all of us when I say, we're excited for what comes next.